Hi everyone, it's a real pleasure to be with you this evening. As Helen said, my name's Amanda Wright, and I am head of Whole School Send at NASEN. I've been working with NASEN for just on 3 years now, but before that I was a primary school SENCo and Senior Leader for over 15 years. So I still see myself in that role. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about overcoming barriers to learning and how we can do that through our teaching. So next slide, please, Emily. Thank you. So what we want to think about this afternoon, firstly, is what do we mean by barriers to learning? And what can we do in our settings to overcome barriers to learning and to support access to education for all of our learners? And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about this short hop CPD journey, the catchy title that we've had for this session, and talk to you a bit about what that means from our perspective at Whole School Send. Next slide, please. Thanks, Emily. So what are barriers to learning? What is it that's preventing some children in our classes from making that progress in their learning? What is it that's stopping them making that next step? So just like a barrier in the road, there is something there that's preventing that progression along their educational journey. But the most important first step for us as educators is to make sure that we have that belief that barriers can be overcome and that good progress is possible for all of our children. We must be the children's champions, their advocates, and that's essential to make sure that all learners can make progress in their learning. And that's just as much about mindset as it is about skill set. And so the first thing I want you to ask yourselves is, do all of the teachers and the support staff and the leaders in your settings, do they really believe that all children can make progress? And if you think that, well, the majority of them do, but you know, the answer, we're not 100% there yet, then this needs to be your first hurdle in sort of overcoming these barriers and enabling the children to make good progress in their learning. Next slide, please. So this pyramid, I'm sure, will be familiar to many of you. And we know through Maslow's work that learning will only occur at the top end of this pyramid, and that learning requires children and young people to take risks, to make mistakes, and then to learn from them. And pupils won't be able to do that until their basic needs and their psychological needs are met. So basically, a barrier to learning is anything that's getting in the way at the lower levels of this pyramid to prevent our children and young people moving up to that stage where they are ready to learn, when they are open to making those mistakes and taking those risks that are associated with learning. They won't be able to prioritize learning until their basic physiological needs are met. So if you have a child who is hungry, who is sleep deprived, or is coming into school having not got those basic needs of warmth and shelter met, then they won't be able to concentrate on the learning in the classroom, and that need to have those basic needs met will override everything else. So think of barriers to learning as anything that's getting in the way in those levels of that pyramid. Next slide, please. Now, Emily, the next slide's not going to work on your, well, it will work, but not in the way we intended, because I was going to do a little Slido here, but we can just spend a bit of time thinking, and maybe you can start to add things in the chat that you can share. In your settings, what are the most common barriers to learning that you are observing in your classrooms, across the school, maybe at other times? So I'll just be quiet for a moment and let you think about that. What are the most common barriers to learning that you are observing in your settings? Okay, next slide, please, Emily. So when we're thinking about those barriers that you're coming up with, we can start to categorize those into two different categories. So into intrinsic barriers, so those which are personal to the individual, or extrinsic barriers, where they are something in the surrounding environment that's causing that barrier to their learning, that's preventing them from moving into the next step. So your intrinsic barriers will include things like cognitive and learning needs. So maybe there's a condition diagnosed in the child, dyslexia, ADHD, autism, a whole range of cognitive or learning needs that might be diagnosed. They may be emotional or behavioural barriers, so anxiety, depression, trauma or other mental health conditions. There may be some language and communication needs, and this could be English as an additional language, as well as speech and language and communication needs that come from a developmental area. They could be extrinsic, so they could be things that are happening outside of the young person themselves. So they're socio-economic factors such as lack of access to resources or unstable home environments. They could be cultural differences, like different learning styles, different cultural norms and expectations, and they could be caused by the school environment itself. And when we think about school environment, I don't just want us to think about the physical environment. We're not just talking about access into the building or access into classrooms, but also think about the curriculum that in your settings, think about the systems that you have in place, both in the classroom and across the school itself. And do any of those processes create barriers to the learning for your pupils? I've added physical disabilities into the extrinsic category, and that's something for us to really pause and think about. We know physical disabilities include things like hearing impairment, vision impairment, and other sort of motor difficulties, fine and gross motor difficulties. But I just want for us to reflect on that and think about, are those difficulties experienced by the young person, are they a barrier to learning because of the young person, or are they a barrier to learning because of the environment that they are in? Should a deaf child experience that barrier to learning because of the hearing impairment that they have? Or should we be able to adapt our environment to enable them to make as good a process, as good progress as their hearing peers? And another question mark I've added on this slide is the idea of special educational needs and disabilities as a whole. And for me, that sits across intrinsic and extrinsic. So there are barriers caused by additional needs that children might have that are inbuilt and they are personal to the children and young people themselves. However, a lot of the barriers that children with SEN and disabilities face are caused by the environment that they are put in, the learning environment that is set up for them, the learning environment that they are expected to be able to learn in. So as teachers, we really need to reflect on that and to think about what can we do through our resources, through our curriculum, through our systems and processes that bring down those barriers as much as possible. And then we can concentrate on supporting the young people with those additional needs that are intrinsic to them. Okay, next slide, please, Emily. And it's quite obvious to say, I'm sure you will all be aware, that we know not many learners will fit neatly into a category of having just one barrier to learning. So it's really important that we pay attention to the experience of living with these multiple vulnerabilities and the effect that that will have on how a learner is or isn't able to access their learning. What educational experience a young person is having will depend on where they sit in this rather complicated Venn diagram that you can see on the screen. And all of these, this experience of these different vulnerabilities that learners may find themselves in, this is what we refer to or we call intersectionality. And it's not just about identifying which individual category or which individual barrier a learner is experiencing and then addressing that in turn. What we really need to do is to understand how all of those vulnerabilities intersect and co-occur and overlap with each other, and to take some understanding around what that might mean for that child in the middle. So if we want to give an example to this, if you think about a child with ADHD living in poverty with little access to outdoor space and opportunities for regular physical exercise, they will be having a completely different lived experience to another child also diagnosed with ADHD who was taken into care at the age of 6 following significant neglect. So we need to take a multi-dimensional approach to understanding what or where a learner's barriers to learning may come from and how they intersect and overlap with each other. Next slide, please, Emily. And I think it's really important for us to have an understanding of the different models of disability and how they impact not on the learner itself, but on society, and how barriers are viewed by people around the individual itself. So you may have heard of the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. And this goes back to that idea of where does physical disability come? Is it an intrinsic barrier? Is it something that is individual and inbuilt into the child or young person themselves? Or is it an extrinsic barrier? Is that disability caused by the environment that they're in? So if you look at the slide on your screen, and we have a wheelchair user by a sign saying "Weigh in, everybody welcome," but the barrier to that person on the screen is the set of stairs. Now, if you are looking at this through the medical model of disability, your view would be that the problem here is the impairment that the person is facing. And the solution to this is that they should be able to cure that impairment or give her prosthetics. And then that would enable her access up the stairs. That would remove the barrier. However, if we're looking at that from a social model of disability, we see that the problem isn't with the person themselves. The problem is with the environment. It's with the stairs. The stairs are the problem. And to remove that barrier, they should build a ramp. So when it comes to barriers to learning, what we need to do is find the right balance. We need to understand what needs changing in the environment. So is it our teaching styles? Is it the strategies we use? Is it the curriculum material? Is it the classroom physical environment itself? And we also need to understand what we can do to help the learner grow or develop themselves. So if we use an example of a reading difficulty being a barrier to learning, we shouldn't take the approach that we're just going to read everything for the child or provide tools so that the reading is done for them. But we must also provide intervention that's going to support the development of the child's reading alongside adaptations to the reading demands that they face in every subject that they come across in the curriculum. We must make those considered and well-chosen choices when we're choosing how we adapt our teaching to ensure learners are able to make progress. That goes back to that idea of intersectionality and understanding where these barriers are coming from and how they're interacting with each other. And if we really understand the experiences our learners are bringing to us, we have a better chance of making our adaptations be as impactful and as effective as possible. Next slide, please, Emily. So how do we make these choices? And again, you've probably seen the analogy or heard the analogy of the iceberg before. Well, we really need to understand what's causing these barriers in the first place. So what we see at the top of the iceberg, what we see above the waves, usually doesn't reflect the scale of the issue. It doesn't usually give us the answers to what we need to do to change our practice to support that learning. We need to be curious about what could be causing that presentation or the behaviour that we're observing. And then once we understand those root causes, the causes that are causing those barriers to learning, we will be better placed to support that need. So if we take the example of a young person who can't, or more accurately, can only follow one part of an instruction, we need to think what might the underlying reasons be for that. So it could be that there's a working memory issue. There could be poor working memory, which then will impact on that child's ability to recall information, to recall words, to hold on to information, and to process new information. So if we want to support a learner, a young person, to be able to hold all of that information they need to follow the longer instruction, they're the areas that we need to be working on. They're the areas that we need to be providing some support and also adapting our approaches to recognise that, and therefore removing some of the barrier. So again, the interventions, the support that we provide to overcome barriers to learning, you'll recognise this triangle probably, where we're looking at providing support at these three levels. At a universal level, and that is, what do we do in our everyday teaching? What is that high quality inclusive practice that supports all learners to make the progress that they are able to make to fulfill their potential? So you'll see that the universal provision, you should see that in every classroom by every teacher, and it benefits all children. Now, there's going to be some children who need a little bit extra than that universal provision isn't going to be quite enough to overcome all of their barriers to learning. So for some children, they're going to need some targeted provision or targeted intervention. And what this looks like could be some additional TA support, additional adult support. It could be some time-limited evidence-based interventions that are really targeting that area of need for that young person. And that is going to be in addition to the universal provision that you're providing for all. Not separate to, in addition to. And you'll see again in this level of the triangle, again, it's in every classroom and it's every teacher, but it will only be for some children. And there are going to be a small number of children who, even with the universal practice that you are giving, the targeted provision that you are giving, they're going to need something more. There's still going to be barriers to their learning. So they are going to need some specialist provision. And this will be in some classrooms that might not, although we hear that we know complexity of need is increasing in schools, so it might be in most classrooms. But again, it's every teacher, few children. So you'll see there that the key point to this slide is that every classroom teacher, every subject teacher needs to be involved at all of these levels in order to successfully support our learners to overcome their barriers to learning. I think historically, and we know the practice continues in some schools, but historically, once that universal offer was exhausted, and children who were still experiencing barriers to their learning, they were sent to another department. They became the care or the responsibility of the SENCo or the SEN teacher. And that practice has changed a lot over years, but we know that in some schools it still remains. And even in some teachers' mindsets, even though they know they've got to adapt their teaching within their class, they're still seeing that children who are identified as having special educational needs or needing that targeted or specialist provision, well, that they're not their responsibility anymore. So it's really important that in your settings, that message is very clear. Every teacher is a teacher of all children, and every teacher has a part to play in overcoming those barriers to learning for all children in their class. You'll see that adaptive teaching, I've mentioned adaptive teaching here, and it's a phrase that we come across a lot now. Adaptive teaching runs through all of that, and that all of those levels of provision. And adaptive teaching is what we are doing in our day-to-day practice to make those changes to meet the needs of all children. It doesn't stop at universal and then change into something else. It doesn't stop at targeted. It doesn't just come in at the specialist bit. It's something that teachers are doing all the time in their day-to-day practice, in that formative assessment, those judgments that they're making in every lesson. They should then be making these adaptations to help overcome those barriers to learning as they experience them minute by minute or lesson by lesson. Next slide, please, Emily. And if we had the animations working properly, what did happen here was the universal part of the triangle moved very nicely to be a bigger portion of the triangle. And what we want to see in our settings, what we want to see when we're moving towards real inclusive practice, is that our universal offer, what we can provide for everybody, grows. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and therefore fewer children will need that targeted and specialist provision. So if we're always adapting what we do, we're reflecting on what we do, we find the children who are struggling or who are still maintaining those barriers to learning, and we're adapting the provision for all, then we'll need to make less and less targeted provision, and because our universal offer will grow and encompass more children. Okay, next slide, please. So how can we do this? We've talked a lot about what we want to see in our classrooms, what we want our class teachers to be able to do, what we want our support staff and teaching assistants to be able to do, and what we want them to, where we want them to be coming from, what we want them to understand. And really that comes down to effective, impactful professional development for all staff. We need to ensure that this is in place in our settings so that we're enabling staff to feel confident, to have the necessary knowledge and understanding to effectively remove those barriers to learning. So just another couple of questions for you to think about, and add some thoughts into the chat. That would be great, because as I'm not sharing my screen, I can see the chat. So what do you think constitutes effective CPD? Other than Twinkl's TeachMeet sessions, obviously, but what else, what other practice happens in your settings that you feel is effective continuing professional development? What do you get the most impact from? When is it most likely to lead to changes in practice? Please do just dot a few things into the chat. Thank you, Natalie. Watching high quality teaching. I don't think that can be under as educators, as teachers, actually being able to go in and observe that effective practice, to observe that adaptive teaching, you know, the micro adaptations as well as the macro adaptations, at what are our peers doing that's actually working really well. A small group of colleagues peer observing. So yeah, collaboration, sharing good practice, sharing the sort of the problem solving approaches to when we are experiencing challenges. You know, when as learners move through settings, talk with your colleagues, what works, what doesn't work. Yes, Sarah's added about whole settings receiving information at the same time, so they're all on the same page. And I think especially when we're talking about mindsets and cultures, that's really important. Quite hard to achieve often, because no, I know it's, you know, it's even when you have a set staff meeting or a set inset day, then it's quite common for somebody to be missing because somebody's got another commitment or attending another course. Training and advice from specialist provisions, absolutely. My experience, as I said earlier, is my background is in mainstream teaching. But I was lucky enough that my school, we didn't quite share a site, but we backed on to a special school, and we were able to have some very impactful collaborations across the staff where they could come and visit us, we could learn from them, and vice versa. We could also go across and see what some of the practice that they were putting in place in their settings. CPD that's relevant to the cohort of children in your class and their needs. And I would take that a bit further, Natalie, to say that the role of us, I don't know how many of you are SENCos on the call today, but the role of the SENCo needs to be looking at that strategically across the school. So if a SENCo has a good understanding of the types of need across the school, then that needs to be built into the CPD that's developed for the whole school, thinking about how those groups of children will be moving through the school. So yes, it needs to be relevant, and that's then going to motivate people to actually take part in it, take it forward in their practice. Okay, great. And then the next question, thanks very much for adding all of those into the chat. The next question is to reflect on your own settings. So what do your schools do to support all of their staff CPD for special educational needs and disabilities, or for what we're talking about tonight? What do your settings do to support teachers, teaching assistants in your schools to overcome those barriers to learning? If you could share some of those in the chat too, that would be excellent. Do you have those opportunities that we've talked about to go and observe peers, or have that time to talk with peers about CPD that you've received, and then how you are translating that into your practice? Is the CPD that you get at school for SEND a bit ad hoc? So you might get somebody come in to present on ADHD one term, then the next term you get something on dyslexia. How do your school do it? Thanks, Julie. Shadowing specialist agencies that come into the school. That sounds great. And I don't know if you're answering the first question or the second question there. Fingers crossed it's the second, because if you've got the opportunity to do that in your school, then that would be excellent. Before I left my role as SENCo, something we did, oh great, that's really good, Julie, thank you. We worked with our speech and language therapists. Many of you may be in areas where that support over the last, or the external support that you're able to access from speech and language therapists over the last number of years has decreased. So we were lucky enough to have a great speech and language therapist, and the way we addressed that was that she worked with some of our reception staff to train them up in the interventions that she would have normally done with our children in reception in year 1. So by sharing that training, that knowledge, we were then able to carry on with our own staff to provide that support for those children. Things like today, having the time to jump onto a CPD webinar, and that's key, isn't it? It's having the time. And I think that all of us, so my colleagues at Twinkl, the work that we do at Whole School Send, we are so aware of the time pressures that you are under. So hopefully what I'm about to show you might help relieve some of that. So I'm going to move on, and now I'm going to share with you the answer to what are short hop CPD journeys. So you've joined this webinar today, which was entitled Short Hop CPD Journeys. And if you could move on to the next slide, please, Emily. Short hop CPD journeys is the catchy phrase that Whole School Send we've decided to give to the part of our offer that really addresses that need of actually not having much time. We know that time is very precious in schools. We also know that SEND CPD is at the top of the priority list for many schools. Many leaders, many classroom teachers are looking for ways to support their staff to improve that practice and provision for their children and young people with SEND. So we are calling these short hop learning journeys because they only take a short amount of time. So what we've developed that through our DFE funded program is some online SEND CPD units. So they're like short e-courses. They're something you can sign into, start at any time, work through, and if you need to leave in the middle of it, you can come back to it, so it saves where you are. So it's not a webinar, it's not a live delivery, it's not a recording, but it's like an online course, and they take between 30 minutes to an hour to complete. The aim of the units is to support classroom practitioners, so teachers, support staff, to identify and address some of the most commonly observed barriers to learning that you will experience or that you'll come across in the classrooms, regardless of age, label, or area of need. Now, we have purposely decided not to take a condition-specific approach or a label-led approach. So when I show you some of the titles of these units in a moment, you'll see that they are not a set of resources, a set of units that you could go on to. Oh, I want to learn about dyslexia. I have a child with dyslexia in my class, I'll go and do the dyslexia unit. Or I have an autistic pupil in my class, I'll go and do the autism unit. They're not presented in that way, and that was a purposeful decision because we recognise that the needs that sit underneath those labels actually cross a variety of conditions, a variety of diagnoses, and beyond. So learners may have barriers to learning or may be experiencing barriers to learning without having a label or a diagnosis. Any of you who've had anything to do with autism assessment pathways will know that that diagnosis can take quite a long time to come, and we can't just sit and wait for that. We've got to be addressing and supporting those needs as they present, not waiting for the letter or for the report to actually qualify it with a name. So we've not taken a label-led approach at all, and we're looking at the needs, those underlying needs, or those barriers to learning that you will come across in your settings. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm just going to walk you through for the next couple of minutes where you'll find these units. So the Whole School Send website, which you can see the address at the top of the slide there. If you click on the resources tab, just in that top bar, you will then, next slide please, Emily. You'll then get a drop down menu, which you will see The yellow arrow shows you there the online SEND CPD units. So if you then, next slide, if you were to click on that, it would take you to a page that looks like this. That's it. It gives a bit more information about them, and then to access the units, you then click on that button there, indicated again by the yellow arrow. Okay, next slide, please, Emily. Once you click on that button, you will get taken to the dashboard. There we go, which will look a little bit like this. You can see the first 3 units there. The others are sitting below that, but I'll share their title, all the titles with you in a minute. You can work through the units in any order that you choose. They are asynchronous, so that a teacher can come to the units with a particular learner in mind and think, okay, so what are the barriers that this individual is facing? They can access the unit. There's a bit of understanding, a bit of theory around why the learner may be presenting in this way. What is it that, that bottom of the iceberg bit, what is it that could be causing these presentations, these behaviors? But there are also some really quick win takeaways, approaches, strategies that teachers can take away and implement that very next day in their classrooms. The first 3 units, while they are asynchronous and you can do them in any order, we would really recommend that the first 3 units are done first. And these are great to do as a whole staff or with a whole group of teaching assistants. And this goes back to that point around are the barriers intrinsic or extrinsic? What can we do to the environment first to make sure that we are removing as many of those barriers as possible by making our environment emotionally safe, socially safe, and physically safe? Right back at the start, a few people popped into the chat. The barriers that they see in their classrooms are around that not feeling safe to make mistakes. The feeling of safety can't be underestimated in enabling our children to make progress in their learning. So those first 3 units really address those ideas of feeling emotionally safe, feeling socially safe, and feeling physically safe. And as you can probably tell, there's a little certificate system there. So if you when you complete 5 units, you get a bronze certificate. When you complete 10, you get a silver certificate, etc., etc. So again, we know lots of across multi-academy trusts and some teaching school hubs are using these to really support their support staff, their teaching assistant sort of development program. And we all love a certificate, don't we? So they can be printed off and sort of stored in a record of professional development. Okay, next slide, please. Which I think is just an example of the certificate which I've given to myself. I've only done 5, so maybe I don't deserve the certificate yet. But the next slide gives you an overview of all of the titles that are available. So these have been in development over the last 2 years. There is one yet to come, and that is one about the building blocks for reading. So that is still in development and due to be launched in November. But you can see there, as I was talking about, really looking at those barriers rather than the conditions. There's one about executive functioning, there's one about memory for learning, there's one about independence. I think something that sticks with me from my quite long career in teaching is the children in year 6 who would still ask when they got to the bottom of their page, should I turn over now? We can be so quick to answer that for them, but that idea of we need to be promoting independence in all of our learners, that's going to support their learning, their access to learning across the board. Okay, so I think that is the end of the information. And my next slide is just a slide that says any questions. So I'm happy to spend 10 minutes taking any questions. There's one question in the chat. Will we get copies of these slides sent through? And Helen has answered that. if you want to access the units, if you just Google Whole School Send, it'll take you to that first that first website. So you should be able to work through there how to get to the units. Good question, Julie. Everything that Whole School Send produce is free to access. As I quickly mentioned at the start, we're funded by the DFE. So the DFE have committed money to improving SEND CPD for the school workforce. And that is through a programme called the Universal SEND Services Programme, which Whole School Send are delivering through NASEN with that funding. The units are just one part of that programme. We've got webinars, there are other, there's professional development groups and other strands, other projects, other activities, professional development activities that you can get involved in, and it is all free to access. So if you know NASEN, if you've used NASEN's resources before, NASEN have some free resources, they have some paid for resources. Whole School Send, we are a team within NASEN, but everything that we do is free to access because the funding comes from the Department for Education. That's why I'm really grateful to Twinkl for allowing me to come along tonight, because we're really passionate that this support is there for schools. And if you don't know about it, you don't know about it. And SEND CPD should be a priority for every school. So we are hoping that, you know, by spreading the word, we're enabling that access and allowing schools to get involved and to really support their staff with their confidence in supporting children and young people with SEND and all children to overcome their barriers to learning.